am a technical I am the Technical Assistance Programs Manager here at CCRH. Again, if you can just take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat, and thank you for joining us for our Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program webinar. You will hear us refer to it as either AHSC or AHSC. Both are correct, although SGC will say one is more correct than the other. Our webinar will be geared toward rural and American Indian tribal communities who are interested in learning more about the AHSC program in advance of round 9. We hope that you learn about the program framework, requirements, successful case studies, and opportunities to receive technical assistance. This webinar will be recorded and slides will be sent out shortly after we complete the presentation. Kate and I are representing the California Coalition for Rural Housing today, and Liz, our Associate Tribal Programs Manager, is also listening in on the call for any questions you may have regarding tribal applicants. We are a statewide affordable housing advocacy nonprofit, and we specialize in rural American Indian, tribal, and farm worker communities. Through advocacy, organizing, research, and technical assistance, our goal is to make the case for rural housing improvement and strengthen the capacity of the nonprofit and public sectors to provide affordable
Start the
housing
recording,
and related
or press
facilities.
any digit to end the recording.
CCRH is part of the state's free technical program for AHSC, and we've also listed other TA providers on this slide that are part of the state-provided TA. We are also joined today by Christine Williams with Enterprise Community Partners, and she'll be assisting us with the Q&A and as well as any questions that pop up in the chat. Today, we want to get started with some background on AHSC, and at its core, the AHSC program is a greenhouse gas reduction program, even before housing and transportation. This program funds projects designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, primarily through a reduction of vehicle miles traveled. This is because AHSC is one of the state's suite of cap and trade funded programs known as the California Climate Investment Programs. Cap and trade auction proceeds are funded into the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, and from there into CCI programs like AHSC. So there must be a nexus of reduced GHGs and VMT between the funding source and the program. We find that if you keep that as your guiding light when developing a scope for this program, you'll have an easier time wrapping your head around it. We will go over some funding and what it's looking like to date. We're at about a $3.8 billion that has been awarded through AHSC throughout the state. The maximum award amount has increased from $20 million to $30 million between round 4 and round 5, and increased again to $50 million in round 7. The total awarded amount in round 7 was $757 million, and we're looking at $687 for round 8. Next, we'll go into some of the goals of AHSC. As we've already mentioned, a major goal of the AHSC program is to reduce greenhouse gases by supporting transportation mode shift. AHSC is also a program about connections and how can we connect housing to jobs and other key destinations through sustainable transportation options such as transit, walking, and biking. AHSC seeks to direct funding into disadvantaged communities in California, and I'll explain in a bit how the program defines those communities. In addition to reducing GHGs, AHSC seeks to support and maximize several community outcomes. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. AHSC is unique in the way that it incentivizes cross-sector partnerships in order to create a truly holistic project. We stress this a lot. The most successful projects are built on the strength of these partnerships. Every partner has something that they can contribute and recognize, and building off of it is truly critical. Also, keep in mind that not every partner necessarily needs to be a formal applicant. Eligible applicants include developers, public agencies, and transit agencies, but there is flexibility regarding how these partners interact and how formal they want the relationship to be. With all of this, it's really what takes part in making this program so unique and why we say that AHSC incentivizes looking beyond the parcel, seeing how the impact of extending benefits beyond a housing site results in all of these important community enhancements. Some eligible capital projects that we can look at and what AHSC can fund. AHSC breaks down costs by program funding categories. We have affordable housing development, housing related infrastructure, sustainable transportation infrastructure, transportation related amenities, and programs. Affordable housing development and HRI costs, our housing related infrastructure, will be the responsibility of the housing developer. Affordable housing development is funding for the brick and mortar, while HRI is an infrastructure cost being required by a locality as a condition of approval for the development itself. Like sewer or utility system upgrades, typically the developer is the entity managing scoping decisions around these items. Then we have STIs, or sustainable transportation infrastructure. These are actual capital improvements such as sidewalks, bike lanes, transit capital items that facilitate mode shift, so they allow people to utilize them for transportation needs versus a car. These costs are typically, but not always, managed by a public agency, as these projects are in the public right of way. Next up, we have TRAs, or transit-related amenities, which can be seen as enhancing the use of the STI items, things like street trees, bus shelters, bicycle parking, lighting, etc. Again, these things are usually managed by the public agency partner. Finally, PGM funds, which are program costs. AHSC will fund program costs such as transit passes for residents, Wi-Fi for residents, anti-displacement policies, any workforce development agreements, and etc. Next, we'll take a look at some more funding terms. Our AHD loan, STI, TRA, HRI, and PGM grants. As you may have noticed, the AHSC program funds capital projects through either loans or grants. So AHD funds will be provided as a loan, and all other funds will be provided as grants and paid out as reimbursements. To provide a clear idea on how these categories are different, we'll go through the following slides and show some examples. Some eligible cost examples for AHD and HRI related infrastructure. AHD can be new construction, rental, multifamily, or senior housing, home ownership, conversion, or acquisition and substantial rehabilitation. For housing related infrastructure is any cost required as a condition of approval for the AHD development by a public agency, deposits and payments for factory built AHD components. Some eligible cost examples for STI are new and improved bikeways, new and improved pedestrian walkways and crosswalks, including signals, any traffic calming measures, complete streets, any bus rapid transit infrastructure at grade, boarding, dedicated lanes, signal priority systems, purchase of new transit vehicles to expand, increase transit services. We also want to know that transit operations can be funded in the STI budget. This is a change that was made in the last round. AHSC staff has also told us that they plan to propose combining TRA and STI for round 9. Some eligible cost examples for transportation related amenities, as we mentioned, can be anything from streetscape improvements such as lighting, signage, any other amenities for pedestrians and cyclists, as well as street furniture, including bus shelters, bike infrastructure with repair kiosks and bike parking, any urban greening, and transit station and stop improvements. For PGM cost examples, there are multiple scoring elements that you can encompass. such as anti-displacement and any other scoring that will kind of just bring your score up, such as active transportation safety and educational clinics, ZEV car share programs, HD resident programming, and any tenant legal counseling. This can also include workforce development, transit passes, and Wi-Fi and broadband. We do want to note that transit passes and Wi-Fi and broadband are a required threshold items. And again, the others are all optional, but they can give you extra points. And from here, we'll pass it off to Kate, who will go into some qualifying transit.
Thanks, Jocelyn. All right. Sorry, my camera froze there for a second. Okay, qualifying transit. So we've talked, or Jocelyn's talked about how you can spend AHSC dollars. Now I'm going to shift us to talk about some AHSC requirements. One of the requirements of AHSC, and this is one that can trip up some of our rural and tribal applicants, is proximity to qualifying transit. Per AHSC, a qualifying transit line requires service that departs 2 or more times on the same route during peak hours as defined by the transit operator. And so one of the threshold items that we look for first is just making sure that the AHD parcel is no more than half a mile from one of these qualifying transit stations or stops. And this distance must be measured along a pedestrian access route. And for projects that don't have a pedestrian access route between the AHD and the qualifying transit stop, that's okay as long as those routes are in place by the certificate of occupancy. It should be noted that AHSC can actually fund the development of this route, and that's through STI or TRA improvements that Jocelyn went over a few slides ago. For ICPs and TODs, those are project types that I'll get into a little bit more later, but for integrated connectivity projects and transit-oriented development projects, this qualifying transit stop has to be in place by time of the AHSC application. But for rural projects or rural innovation project area types, there's a little bit more leeway there. You can have your qualifying transit station in place by certificate of occupancy for the AHD if you are a rural community. The service at this transit station or stop, again, it doesn't have to be funded through STI, but it can be if you would like it to. Okay, continuing along with some requirements. All of the AHSC funded project components like the AHD, the HRI, the STI, and the TRA that Jocelyn just discussed must be within the project area. For those projects that are transit-oriented development or integrated connectivity projects, the project mile radius is 1 mile. But for rural projects, the project area radius is 2 miles. I will define again these project area types further on the next slide. But for this slide, the important things to know is that the center of the project area radius can be any point within the affordable housing development parcel. And this kind of mapping tool, again, is one of the first things we do just so that you can see what area you have to work within. The only exception for going outside of the project area boundary is if you have an STI project that extends beyond it. You are allowed to do that as long as that project has an entry point or a starting point within that project area. So here are the project area types that we've already started talking about. These are transit-oriented development, or TOD, integrated connectivity project, or ICP, and rural innovation project area, or RIPA. So the TOD projects are those that tend to be in more urban areas. This would be like a good example in a San Francisco area or an LA area. These projects have high quality transit, meaning that at that qualifying transit stop, the buses are departing 15-minute frequencies. transit-oriented development projects receive 35% of the overall funding for AHSC, meaning that when the NOFA comes out, we can see how much funding is going directly towards TOD, and that'll be the 35%, a good chunk. And then the minimum densities needed for a TOD are pretty high, so they'll be at 30 units per acre as a minimum. Similarly for ICP, these projects are a lot less dense, a lot less urban than the TOD projects. They're more your suburban area project types. There's not the same level of high quality transit required for ICPs, and they still receive 35% of the total funding as determined in the NOFA. And they have a slightly lower minimum density requirement of 20 units per acre. For RIPAs, which is what we're focusing a lot of our conversation around today, it doesn't really matter what level of transit is available, as long as it's located within a rural area. And we'll go over the definition of a rural area in a few slides. So it could either have high quality transit or transit that at least departs 2 times during peak hours. And then RIPA projects receive 10% of the set aside of the total funding set by the NOFA, and they have a smaller minimum density requirement of 15 units per acre. So in addition to these percentages, 35% going to TOD, 35% to ICP, and 10% going to RIPA, the AHSC program has a couple of other funding set-asides. At least one project per round should be going to an eligible tribal entity if there are enough tribal entity projects that apply. And then at least one project per round will go to each of the geographic areas set by AHSC. And here are those geographic areas. You can see the map. This is from the round 8 applications on the right-hand side. We have all of these AHSC regions listed on the slide here as well. I'm not going to read all of them, but this is available on SGC's website. Okay, so how do you determine if your project is a RIPA? AHSC uses the same definition for rural as the Tax Credit Allocation Committee. So you'll be familiar with this methodology if you've submitted a tax credit application. A project competing as a RIPA must meet one of 3 methodologies listed on the slide. The first is that it's within one of these non-metropolitan counties. The second is that it's in a rural housing service or RHS eligible area, as determined by USDA. And the third is small city status. So you have to meet both the population threshold and your census tract must not be designated as urban. Okay, so this is a list of not all of the thresholds, but some of the main ones that can trip up some of our applicants that we work with. So the first thing that we do when we're assessing a project's readiness for AHSC is to look at whether it meets these specific list of thresholds. These are like I mentioned, really make it or break it points early in the application cycle. So first, we had already talked about the minimum densities that you need to achieve depending on what project type you are. You also have to be able to show that you have site control in order to develop the project. You also have to have the requisite developer experience, and that's for all components of your project. So if you're the affordable housing developer, you have to have experience that shows that you have created at least 2 affordable housing developments similar in scope and size over the last 10 years. Similarly, if you're working with a transit agency and they have, an STI improvement that they're developing, that agency also has to show that they have the requisite experience needed in order to develop that project. You also have to have all of your land use approvals and environmental clearances in place at time of application. Housing element compliance is a big one. I know the prior housing element round 6, was a tricky one for a lot of jurisdictions. So the housing element compliance last round was pretty pivotal and pretty timely. So we want to always note that one on this slide as well. And then the FMMP and infill threshold we'll actually go over in a few more slides in more depth, but that one's pretty critical for our rural projects. The affordable housing development must also have all electric construction, meaning that there's no gas in the building. 3 years of free Wi-Fi. This is something that Jocelyn mentioned a few slides ago as well. And then 1 indoor bike parking space per 2 units. This is quite a lot of bike parking. We want to be sure to note it so that people's architects aren't mad at us at the last minute when they have to redo things, and make sure there's enough space for that bike parking on site. Okay, so we talked about thresholds. We talked about some things that we keep in mind, especially for rural applicants. This slide really covers some of the nuances and the guidelines for tribal applicants. So first, the guidelines define tribal entities as tribally designated housing entities, federally recognized tribes, and also tribes listed on the Native American Heritage Commission list. So it's more expansive than just being available to federally recognized tribes, which we're grateful for. The guidelines also define Indian country as any rancheria, reservation, trust, or acquired land. The guidelines also on page 72, which I believe is Appendix B of the guidelines. There's a lot of good information on there. The guidelines also have information on the limited waiver of sovereign immunity. This is something that is required in the standard agreement if you are awarded as a tribal applicant, and we want to make sure to note that up front. Tribal entities may request exemptions from the infill requirement that we'll talk about in a slide or two, which is a good flexibility to have. And then there's also some flexibility in the AMI that tribal applicants can use. And then also in terms of flexibility, the AHSC program follows AB 1010 waivers, as long as, so that means that tribes or tribal applicants can request waivers from certain standards within the guidelines using the AB 1010 process. And then again, site control, it's important to note here that site control evidence for a tribal applicant can include an attorney's opinion, and then a title status report as well. Okay, so this slide goes over some of the key RIPA thresholds that are sticking points for some of our rural applicants. We've already talked about the density, which is 15 units per acre. I just want to note here that a lot of the rural projects that we work with actually exceed this density. So even though this is a threshold, to be competitive, quite a few rural projects go up to 20 units per acre or higher. And then secondly on this slide, the farmland mapping and monitoring program is a really good tool. We have a link to it on the slide, but essentially one of the requirements of the AHSC program is that you're not developing on farmland. And that's not just prime farmland or farmland of statewide importance. That can mean anything from unique farmland to grazing land and a lot of the other categories that are listed in on this slide. So it's really important that you check that with this mapping tool before you get too far along in the AHSC process. If you do happen to have a site that is on farmland, there is an alternative threshold you can meet, and that's the infill threshold. You would just need to be able to show that 75% of the perimeter of your site is already on developed land. So if that sounds like kind of a lot and kind of confusing, never fear, because that's what TA is for. We're happy to help you determine if you have farmland of importance or if you meet that infill threshold. So we talked a little bit about qualifying transit. Having the qualifying transit station or stop within the half-mile of the project site and that has service that departs at least twice or more during peak hours is the requirement here. Because this can be a tough threshold to meet, the program allows for flexible transit, meaning transit with flexible routing and shared ride modes like van pools, shuttles, and paratransit. And that's something that our rural applicants like to see quite a bit in case they can take advantage of it. Okay, so we are moving along here on thresholds. There are just a few more, but these are performance thresholds. And these are also just as critical. So some of the key things to note here is that AHSC can only fund projects that have not started construction. And it also requires that projects be completed within 5 years of the standard agreement. And that's all project components, not just the affordable housing development, but also what you commit to do with regard to bike and ped infrastructure, as well as transit improvements. Okay, so this last bullet is not a threshold item, but Jocelyn kind of hinted to it earlier in these slides, and I wanted to kind of close the loop on it. But because AHSC requires that housing and transportation projects are included in the application, there's a lot of different parties responsible for building out those projects, and they all have certain legal obligations. So in order to sort of meet these requirements, there's a lot of different ways that you can structure your partnerships and your application. If parties want to apply as joint applicants, meaning if the affordable housing developer, the city, and maybe the local transit agency want to apply as joint applicants, they'll need council or board resolutions indicating their intent to apply at time of application. We note that here just because sometimes those have a long lead time to get before your board or your council. If the parties that are like the city or the transit agencies don't want to be applicants officially, but want to be involved as non-applicants, you can enter into side agreements with them, or you can include a commitment to enter into a contractual agreement with them if funds are awarded. And we as TA providers have templates available for each of those options. So I also want to note that homeownership projects have some additional threshold items. At least 20% of all homeowner units must be affordable, and any scattered site projects will need a single owner entity. Let's see. We also mentioned that AHSC funds homeownership through a grant structure instead of a loan structure. And then all units must additionally be available to first-time home buyers. Okay, so we talked about the threshold requirements, just getting into the door. But this slide is more about starting to think about how you can compete and how you want to size your AHSC request or the dollar amount that you ask for. The first thing to consider when determining how to size your request is pretty straightforward. You need to calculate how much you can ask for each restricted unit per the HCD loan limit guide. Second, your transportation allocation, or your STI, is 25% or 7.5 million of the total AHSC request. Let's see. This includes both your transit and active transportation improvements. And then there's an additional 5% or 1.5 million, whichever is the lowest amount, of the total request that should be going towards transportation amenities. And again, those are things like bus shelters, benches, and bike parking. There are also points allocated for the GHG efficiency score, which calculates your total GHG reductions per your AHSC dollar request. So there's some incentive for keeping your total request low, especially if your GHG reductions are not going to be very high, which we have found is the case quite often for both rural applicants and tribal applicants. Okay, so this slide goes over the scoring criteria. We have the points list, the total points listed here. It's out of 100 points, but this isn't like other funding applications where you have to receive a perfect score in order to be able to compete. A couple things that are most noteworthy on this slide is that your GHGs are worth 30 points, so 30% of your score, which is quite a bit. So it's really important that you address that pretty early on in your application, either with your technical assistance provider or with the project partners. The next criteria on this slide is quantitative policy points. This is worth up to 52 points per the current guidelines. Many of these points come from your transportation improvements, like your proposed bike and ped developments, but you can also get points for things like being in a pro-housing designated jurisdiction, for funding anti-displacement work, and for being near key destinations. And then finally, the last bucket of points comes from narrative-based policy. So these are the questions and prompts within the application that are more narrative and give you the chance to really tell the story of your project. And then the narrative questions are really centered around community engagement, climate resiliency, air pollution, exposure mitigation, equity, and transformation. Okay, so we're in the final stretch now. I did want to sort of close this out with a couple of case studies that are really good examples of past AHSC awardees. I wanted to start us off first with the 30th Street Commons project. This is a really cool project. It became the first tribal-led project funded through AHSC back in 2018 and round 6. It was a partnership between City of Arcata and the Yurok Indian Housing Authority. It's really cool. It features a community garden, wetlands restoration, and then native vegetation, of course, bike lanes and walkways, and a 1-mile trail pedestrian bridge. The Yurok Indian Housing Authority was able to obtain 9% tax credits to leverage their AHSC award in order to build this project. It's affordable housing that's connected to really nearby amenities that were really important for the tribe's membership, including a Native American health clinic, and then some of the surrounding universities. And then the next project I wanted to go over is from round 7. It's the Eureka Scattered Sites project, which was a partnership with the City of Eureka, Link Housing Corporation, and the Humboldt Transit Authority. This project is a little bit more dense than the prior one that we looked at. It's a scattered site across 3 different sites in downtown Eureka, totaling about 90 units per acre. This project was really cool too, because it really is a good example of a very strong and committed partnership between all 3 parties, the city, the developer, and HTA, the transit agency. They had been really wanting to expand their micro transit service throughout the city. And this was the perfect opportunity to do so, and also score some GHG reduction points. So through AHSC, they purchased 2 battery electric microtransit vehicles and charging infrastructure for the neighborhood. And this is going to be a really exciting project when it's all said and done. And then finally, the most recent example is from round 8. I should note that it hasn't received its award officially, but that will happen this Thursday at SGC's council meeting. But this project, again, is a lower density project. It's 40 units of affordable housing in King City, which has a lot of farm workers in that community. So the focus is truly on farm worker housing, which made it a good fit for partnering with CalVans. This project will purchase electric vans through CalVans, and the purpose of which will be to ferry farm workers from this project site to a lot of the ag employers in the region. So we were really excited to help with this one. It's another scattered site project spread over a few different parcels within the larger Mills Ranch subdivision. And because this project had kind of low GHG reductions, the applicant chose to really limit their AHSC dollar ask. So this in turn helped with their GHG efficiency score that we talked about a few slides ago. Okay, so those were the case studies. With that, I'm going to pass it back to Jocelyn for a couple of closing slides before our Q&A.
Thank you, Kate. So to wrap us up, we do want to go over some next steps and also just want to highlight that your GHG score is very important and larger projects with more units confers an advantage. Again, a perfect score is not required to win awards, unlike other programs like tax credits. And a reminder again, as Kate mentioned, that your application must include substantive bike and ped project components and a transit component that increases ridership. In the meantime, as you're considering all of this, we do encourage you to start looking at whether your project can achieve the AHSC thresholds and start connecting with your project partners. You can also secure some TA early on if you believe you need it. And it's never too early to start preparing for the next round. We always encourage individuals to start now if you can, and if you're interested. AHSC timeline, and we encourage folks to start engaging with your partners in summer, fall 2024, which is around now. We also, in winter is when guidelines will be finalized and the NOFA will be released in January, just to keep an eye out for that. Applications are due in spring of 2025, and we'll be hearing award announcements in August, just like we've just heard about round 8, and we're looking forward to finalizing those. Now to focus on what applicants should be doing to prepare for the potential AHSC application. If you've reviewed whether or not your project can achieve thresholds, then we recommend that you start engaging with your partners and just take a look at threshold determination letters and initial and other point score letters. And lastly, thank you all for being here, for your engagement. We look forward to continued participation. These are our emails for technical assistance providers, Christine Williams and Alejandro Huerta from Enterprise Community, and Kate and I from CCRH. I have all of our emails here. We also encourage you to sign up for capacity building. If you're interested in applying for round 9 and need technical assistance, sign up for the SGC email list because they will send a questionnaire in the fall for applicants interested in receiving free technical assistance, or you could contract with a TA provider. And we just want to say that there is another webinar on September 10th for community engagement and best practices, which we encourage you to join as well. It'll be hosted by Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability, and the webinar will focus on how to create an inclusive and community responsive AHSC applications and the benefits engagement can bring to a competitive AHSC project. Again, thank you all for being here today. And we will open up for any questions you may have.
Do you have a question that just got dropped into the chat? Christy asking if we can share more about the loan for the ASIC program. I can shed a little light if that's helpful. But Christy, so the loan, because it's financing offered through the State Department of Housing and Community Development, is structured similar to their other loan offerings. I believe this slide showed a 3% interest rate over 55 years. So if you're familiar with any of HCD's other programs, it follows, there it is, it follows that structure. And if you have more, you want some more detailed information, feel free to reach out to one of us and we can offer that. I believe, I don't know, I might put Craig Shields on the spot if he's still in the webinar from HCD. I believe it is a forgivable loan. I don't know if you can come off mute, but. Okay. Christy, I got your.
Sorry, yes, I'm sorry. It took me a
Hey,
moment
Craig.
to find. Can you hear me?
Yes.
It is not forgivable. It's residuals. Like all of the points you have there are correct, but I would not call it forgivable.
Okay. All right. We got a couple other questions coming in. Thank you, Craig. I'll bump this one over to CCRH, but the question is, can you explain qualifying transit for rural projects again? Whether there's a headway requirement and whether you could use EV car sharing to potentially support that.
Yes, I can cover that one. So qualifying transit for rural project types has basically the transit has to depart twice during peak hours. Also, as we discussed, that qualifying transit site has to be half a mile from the affordable housing development along a pedestrian access route. So usually what I do if I'm double checking is I, go to my Google Maps, check the distance out, and then I go to the transit agency's website to check their schedule and make sure that it meets that peak hour departure twice during peak hour, and once during the AM and once during the PM commutes. So that cannot really be, you can't meet that qualifying transit threshold through car sharing. However, the AHSC program does allow for some EV car sharing. Like you can still propose that as a scoping element of your project in order to get GHG reductions, especially if that's something that is of interest to the community that your affordable housing development is in. And I think I hope that answered your question, Michael.
Yeah, we've got some additional questions we're answering in the chat around peak hour definitions. Claudia has a question about development and tribal partnerships and whether there are any examples of this that have been done in Utah or the Mountain West. Claudia, this is a program that awards exclusively within the state of California, so it's not available, unfortunately, elsewhere. Kate or Jocelyn, any kind of comments about tribal partnerships there?
Yeah, Claudia, feel free to add some more information if you're thinking of anything in particular, but we have seen a couple of examples in past rounds of successful partnerships between developers who, are more typical affordable housing developers and can score or not score, who can meet the threshold of developer experience, partnering with tribes that don't have the same development experience, or at least what's required per the AHSC guidelines, but have a need, maybe have a site in mind that they have ownership of, and they have, a need for affordable housing for their tribal membership. So there's definitely examples in past rounds that we could point to. I think last round, I want to say it was Kashaya and Burbank Housing And if anyone remembers different, they can correct me in the chat. But they formed a really good partnership, both to, like I said, have meet that affordable housing developer experience, but also serve the tribe and make sure that they're developing culturally responsive housing.
Thanks, Kate. Couple questions. So ASIC is in place until about 2030. So we should hopefully get a few more rounds out of the program. We dropped a definition of what is meant by peak hour periods. So you can look at the chat, and if you have some additional questions about that, we can answer those either offline or here if we have the time. And then there is a question that I know rural projects in particular face a lot around net density and to what extent you can exclude certain sort of categories of land from your overall net density. So I will bump that back to CCRH to respond to.
Yeah, there are quite a few things that you can exempt from your net density. And what I'll probably do, because it's a laundry list, is post it in the chat for you, Matt. And I'll break it up into two. Oh, Alejandro beat me to it. Okay, so allowed deductible areas or septic system requirements, public land dedications for streets, public sidewalks, public open space, and public drainage facilities. What I'll do too is put the list of non-allowed deductible areas too, because that can trip people up underneath Alejandro's in response to your question, Matt.
Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, and if you have a particular site in mind, Matt, feel free to reach out to the TA providers on this call. We're happy to help talk through a net density question.
Great. We'll be in touch.
Sounds good.
Thanks, everyone.
Typical.
Oh, yep, you're on it, Kate.
I just saw the typical parking ratio for rural projects. I think I'll probably say that I think AHSC is not a program that likes too much parking. So I think the GHG calculator we tend to encourage people to shoot for a parking ratio of 1-to-1. Is that right, Christine?
Yes, generally, Michael, we're not seeing a lot above 1-to-1, and that's partially because, as Kate mentioned, you start to get penalized when you're running your inputs through the greenhouse gas reduction calculator.
But again, Michael, similar offer that I made to Matt. If you have a particular project in mind and you already know what the parking ratio is, feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to try to calculate that with you and give you an idea of what that looks like. Okay, we'll be sure to hang out here a couple more minutes in case anybody else has any more questions. Feel free to come off mute or to drop them in the chat. Okay, thanks all for joining. We don't have to, again, CCRH and Enterprise will probably stick around until the hour, until 2 p.m. So stick around if you have any questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining us and for your engaged questions. We hope we hear from you soon if you're interested in round 9.